Hello to all the debt warriors listening, and welcome back to another episode of Millennial Debt Domination. I'm your host, Katie Fata. The month of February can be associated with love because Valentine's Day falls in the middle of the month. Many people get engaged on this holiday and closely after are looking to plan their dream wedding. Before you start planning your dream wedding, you'll need to sit down with your partner and plan your wedding budget. A wedding budget is absolutely necessary when it comes to your big day. You and your partner need to discuss all the different factors that not only go into your wedding day, but also what you want your finances to look like after your wedding day. I am super excited to be joined by today's guest. I'll be joined by the Budget Savvy Bride herself, Jessica Gibson. Jessica runs the Budget Savvy Bride website, which helps you plan your wedding on a budget you can actually afford. She's super knowledgeable about not only wedding planning, but how to make the most of your wedding budget. Jessica and I will be discussing factors that need to go into your wedding budget, wedding budgeting mistakes, hiring a wedding planner, and much more. Now, let's get to my interview with Jessica. Hi, Jessica. Thanks for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited.
Yes, you are the Budget Savvy Bride. So I am so honored to have you as a guest today. This is such a great topic, planning your budget wedding. We haven't done this topic yet, but we've definitely been talking about it. So I'm really glad to have you on as a guest.
Yeah, super excited to chat all things wedding and budgeting and hopefully share some advice that'll help your listeners.
Yeah, I hope so. So I guess to get started, we could talk about where is the first place to start when creating a budget for your wedding?
Well, I think it all starts by kind of looking at what you've got, right? Like looking at your personal savings between you and your partner and kind of thinking like, what are we looking at budgeting for beyond just the wedding day? Because I think obviously it's a big event. It is going to take a chunk of money in most cases, but you also want to keep it in context of like your greater, life goals and plans and what sort of money those are going to take as well. Mm-hmm. And then obviously, a lot of times it's not just you and your partner who are paying, maybe your families are contributing as well. And so starting off by like having those conversations with your families, finding out, how much they plan to contribute, if any, and, factoring that into your figure as well. And then, depending on how long of an engagement you plan to have, how much you can save along the way to put towards the wedding fund as well.
Yeah, I like that you brought up beyond the wedding day because I think a lot of people don't even think of that. They just think about the big day.
Right. They've got their eye on the prize, I guess. But thinking beyond because, you might have a certain amount of money in your savings, but you don't want to blow it all on the wedding, right? Because maybe you're planning to, buy a house or start a business or, expand your family. So keeping those things in mind and creating a budget that, allows you to have the wedding that you want, but also plan for those things that come after the big day as well.
Right. So when you're looking at this wedding budget, the big picture, what are some of the biggest factors that usually go into the budget?
So obviously beyond, your personal financial circumstances, when it comes to the wedding itself, there's a few things to keep in mind. I think your guest count is one of the obvious and biggest impacts on how much you'll probably need to be able to throw an event. And then, the season of the year that you're getting married, depending on where you live, there's what, wedding vendors and venues consider a peak season and an off-peak season. And it can definitely vary depending on, where in the country or where in the world you might be choosing to get married. And certain times of the year are going to be probably more affordable because they're not as popular. Same thing with day of the week. I think all the COVID couples who have been planning throughout the pandemic over the last couple of years, and especially this year in 2022, are seeing that they're having to choose maybe not a Saturday night, which is most common, but you can save by doing a Friday or a Sunday in some cases, Although now dates are so hard to come by that
Uh-huh.
couples are turning to midweek wedding dates to save and to also just be able to get married this year. So all those things can definitely come into play.
Yeah, I actually have two weddings this year, and one's a Friday and one's a Sunday. So I definitely see that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which, if you do like a holiday weekend or something, you
Right.
can make it a whole thing. But
Exactly.
yeah, there's benefits either way, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So, out of all those factors or any other factors, is there one thing that should be prioritized in a wedding budget?
Well, I think it depends on, you and your partner. So one thing I always recommend is that couples, sit down together at the beginning of this whole process and talk
Mhm.
about what is your vision for this wedding? Like, what do you want it to look like? What do you want it to feel like? Do you want it to be small and intimate with like just your closest friends and family? Do you want it to be something big and
Mhm.
like a big fun party? That's gonna, impact a lot of the choices you make along the way. And so really sitting down and getting clear on what actually matters to the both of you. And sometimes that's not going to be exactly the same. Like maybe one of you really is into food and you want to have like just an incredible meal served, but one of you really wants to splurge on like a live band. These are important things to discuss about like what each of your priorities are, so you can find, a happy middle ground and kind of like make those
Yeah.
compromises within the two of you. I always think that, planning a wedding is such a great exercise in, open communication, budgeting, and, meeting each other in the middle and compromising on the things that you both want.
Yeah, I was definitely going to say compromise is important. Yeah, that is a good,
Yes.
it's a good start, a good lesson. That I like that.
Yeah,
So,
it's a joint challenge that you're
yeah.
tackling together, and a great, example of how to work as a team as well.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. So, is there anything common that couples forget to include in their wedding budget?
Some of the things that I most commonly see are things like, wedding vendor, like gratuity, like
Oh,
tips
okay.
and things like that. Factoring that in, we actually have like a handy chart on our
Okay.
website that you can reference for things like that. There's always like random surprise fees, right? Like
Hmm.
cake cutting fees or like the cleanup or setup fees for, your venue rentals, things like that. It's important to really look at all the quotes that you're getting along the way and like go over those contracts and agreements, like with a fine tooth comb. And I think another thing some people are surprised by or forget is, your vendors who are traveling or coming to service your wedding day. Like if your venue doesn't provide free parking, like you might have to pay for parking for the vendors, you might have to pay transportation costs depending on the situation. So just things to look out for when you're looking at vendor contracts.
Or even like dinner for the vendors too, because I know some places don't include it necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. Including your vendors in your basically your head count for your
Mhm.
meals
Yeah.
is a good idea, which some people I think are surprised by because they're like, oh, well,
Hmm.
like anybody else who's working a job like doesn't get fed by their employer. But
Hmm.
in the events industry, it is kind of like an expected thing.
Yeah.
So definitely an important one for sure.
Yeah, especially if it's going to be all day. You don't expect them to eat for 10 hours. You have to feed them. Yeah, I do think a lot of people forget about it.
Yeah, I actually assisted a wedding photographer for a couple of years as an
Hmm.
assistant.
Hmm.
And, like you can't just survive on a Cliff Bar to get through
Right.
a 10-12 hour wedding day. So,
Yeah, definitely. And the gratuity is such a good point that a lot of people forget. And then I will link the link from your website in the description of this podcast, this chart you said, so everyone can get that there if they need it.
yeah,
Yeah.
awesome.
So, what is a common mistake made with wedding budgets?
I think the biggest mistake couples can make is not sitting down and actually crunching those numbers
Mhm.
before you go out and start planning things, right? Because if you don't have like a solid idea of what you're not only like able to spend but
Mhm.
willing to spend
Mhm.
on this event, it's easy to, just go out and like fall in love with the venue that's maybe not going to fit into the overall puzzle of putting the rest of your wedding budget together. And so figuring out what that, total budget is that you're, hoping to spend before you start meeting with vendors, I think is a really good idea. And one thing I always kind of suggest is to, obviously there's the media numbers out there talk about like the average wedding budget for the United States. Like, it's one of those things where I always say like your budget should depend on your personal circumstances and not like what averages are. I mean, truthfully, you can plan a wedding on whatever budget you've got. It's just probably going to look different than maybe you would think if it's a smaller than average number. But there's some good websites out there. I think one is like costofwedding.com, and you can actually see some figures from your local area. I think they do it by zip code. And so that's a good place to get a little bit of information just to see like what the averages are. But again, if you're resourceful, if you're willing to put in the legwork, do your research, maybe do some things yourselves, call in some favors, there's lots of ways to cut costs like across the board in any category of the wedding.
Oh, for sure. There definitely is. You just have to, if like DIY and everything, there's definitely ways to.
Yes. I mean, time is money though, right? Like,
that's true. You have to weigh things out, I think, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think, you really have to look at your personal set of circumstances, your skill set, to your time availability, and consider all of those things when you're making these decisions.
Yeah, definitely. So do you think there's a part of the day that's underestimated when it comes to the budget?
I think one that surprises a lot of couples is flowers, just because they're expensive. I mean, just plain and simple. Not only are you paying for, the hard cost of the flowers, which are often, shipped in from out of the country in a lot of cases, but also paying for, the time and labor of the florist to arrange them, deliver them, set them up, and all of that. And so that's one that I think a lot of couples have sticker shock about. But one of the most expensive pieces of the wedding day obviously is associated with all of the different reception costs, but especially, feeding your guests, the catering and stuff. So one thing that I always love to recommend is finding a venue that will allow you to bring in your own alcohol, because that is a huge markup when you go through like a traditional catering company or even a restaurant. And so if you're able to go out and source your own alcohol to be served at your wedding bar, you can have a lot more control over the cost per bottle or the varieties or quantities. And so that can be a really great way to save.
Yeah. And then you could bring in your own bartender too, and that will probably save you money.
Yeah. It really depends on your venue, but especially if you are working with kind of a tight budget, I always recommend, looking for outside of the box, kind of more alternative venues that maybe aren't traditionally used for weddings, but give you more of that flexibility. It is going to take more legwork, more research, and maybe more organizing on your part. But if it's the bottom line, of your budget that you're most concerned about, then it's probably worth it in the end.
Yeah. So we definitely talked about factors that go into the actual wedding day. What about the rehearsal dinner? Should that be factored into the overall wedding budget?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because obviously it kind of depends on like you and your partner, if you're a same-sex couple versus a, mixed gender couple. It's like traditionally, right, in the scheme of weddings, the bride's family pays for the wedding and the groom's family pays for the rehearsal dinner in a lot of cases. But now I think, couples are kind of doing, a mixture, and everybody's kind of throwing in on different things. So while it is a separate event, it's still an expense if you guys are contributing towards it. So, it's definitely something you should be budgeting for, no matter what that, looks like and who's paying.
Yeah. Right. So now that we do have like all the factors that should go into our wedding budget, how early do you think couples should start budgeting for their wedding?
Start budgeting or start saving?
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I think it truly depends on the couple, but I never think it's a bad idea to start saving in advance for anything.
Right.
Obviously, hopefully you're living below your means and putting money away every month, and maybe some of that will go to a house, maybe some of that will go towards a wedding. If you're in a serious relationship, I mean, why not, stash some cash away? I love a good like automatic draft savings plan. And setting it and forgetting it, and just knowing that money is being stored away for when the time comes is never a bad idea. Obviously it's tough these days because there's so many expenses and variables and unknowns, but I don't think it's ever too early to start saving.
Yeah. And I think maybe even leading up to your wedding, you can like alter your lifestyle a little bit, like maybe not go out to eat as much leading up to it and, save that money instead.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's totally fine. I was going to say, like during the course of my engagement, I actually got laid off and I moved back in with my parents. And so, I was able to save more money, like living at home for a while. And I know a lot of couples may, if they're not living together before, they might move in together to save money. But yeah, there's obviously like so many different, lifestyle changes, things you can cut back on to put more money away. I'm also a big fan of what I like to call the bride hustle instead of a side hustle. Like as a bride, picking up a side job, or starting to babysit or walk dogs, or maybe even doing like Uber or Lyft or something, anything to bring in a little bit of extra money, knowing that that's going to go towards an aspect of your wedding that you maybe really prioritize and you want to be able to splurge on, but wouldn't be within your budget otherwise. I love that. Even just like selling some of your stuff that you're not using anymore on Poshmark or Mercari or eBay,
Yeah.
There's so many things that you can do if you just have a little bit of time. So
yeah, and if you're kind of changing your lifestyle, not going out as much as you could do those your bride hustle in the meantime. I love that word. I'm going to use that. So that kind of leads into my next question. If there's like, do you think there's anything specific people like specific budgeting techniques for couples when it comes to their wedding budget? We kind of mentioned like adding a side hustle for extra income. Anything else do you think?
I mean, I think one thing that you could do, and something that I actually did, I have a background in graphic design. I went to school for graphic design. So I actually started working for my wedding photographer, like part-time during my engagement, because I had been laid off from my job. And so I basically kind of like worked off my photography balance for my wedding. So I mean, it's not something maybe that's applicable or like approachable to everyone, but think about the skill set you have and what you could offer to someone in exchange for a service or a product for your wedding. Like I say, like beg, borrow, barter, don't steal. Like that's the line, like don't steal, but
right.
Anything you can do to cut the costs, especially if, funds are tight. I don't see anything wrong with it. You got to get creative. That's the thing about that I think is interesting about, what we do at the Budget Savvy Bride. Like budgeting is a big part of it, but it's also being savvy. And I think savvy is more about being really smart and like resourceful with whatever budget that you have. So I say, your limit is only like the extent of your creativity and what you're willing to do and time you're willing to spend.
Yeah, that's some great advice. And then did you end up using that photographer for your wedding?
I did. Yeah.
Okay. See, so that's great. So that's one way that you saved on your wedding. Is there any other ways that someone could save on their wedding, and what factors impact the price of the overall wedding?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely, like I said, the alcohol tip is a huge one. Finding a venue that will allow you to provide your own alcohol. I actually served like Trader Joe's wine, like $2 chuck or $3 chuck, whatever. But we made custom labels, like wine labels. So we peeled off the Trader Joe's wine labels and put our own little cute labels on them. So nobody knew that we were serving cheap wine. They were just happy to have something to drink, like things like that. If you want to have a limited bar instead of a full open bar, I mean, obviously, is a huge way to save money. And, maybe creating a couple of signature cocktails instead of that full open bar is a great way to do that, because you're still offering, a cute branded sort of like drink experience to your guests without, completely blowing your budget.
Right.
And then like unique catering ideas. Like I love how creative couples are getting these days. I've seen a lot of like food truck weddings, which I think is so fun and interactive. And, food that may not be considered traditionally like wedding fancy,
Right.
but like pizza or tacos or, something that's like really good and really delicious, but also really affordable.
Oh, those are some great ideas. I love them. And I think with the alcohol thing, that's such a good idea. And even if you can't do it at the wedding, maybe like a bring your own rehearsal dinner, if you can find a place that does that to save you money there.
Yeah, or even a potluck, honestly.
Oh
Like
yeah.
we've seen lots of, especially if you're doing if you're most of your guest list are local, right? And they're not having to travel, like doing a potluck rehearsal dinner or something like that, especially if you're on a tight budget, is a great way to save. And, it obviously depends on like your, group of friends or family and like how you might feel about that. But if you're laid back and like you're the people who love you and support you and want to help you have an amazing day, like they're gonna be game, So
yeah,
I love things like that as well.
There are definitely so many like savvy ways to get creative nowadays. It's awesome.
Yeah.
So, when you have a wedding, you never know what could happen. You might need a backup plan. So, what are some budgeting tips for creating a backup plan? Because I feel like a lot of people might not even think about one or budget for it necessarily.
So when you say backup plan, do you mean like a rain plan?
Yeah, or like a bad weather plan, anything that can happen like
right.
that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's like so many unforeseen circumstances. Like I think, all the pandemic couples can attest to that. Nowadays, like wedding insurance is really, really popular and a good idea. Obviously, right now, like pandemic related cancellations aren't covered by insurance policies, but they can be, a lifesaver and a budget saver when it comes to inclement weather. If for some reason you have like a hurricane or tornado or something like that, as a lot of people have experienced. So I think that's a really good thing to have as an insurance policy. They're generally like not super expensive. It could be just a few $100s to cover your event, depending on the size, but it's definitely a good thing to look into. And then if you are planning an outdoor wedding of any kind and you're kind of doing it yourself, having a backup plan is crucial. I can attest to that myself. We had planned to have an outdoor reception and it rained like torrentially the entire week before, and like the yard was muddy at the venue. It was like a whole thing, but we ended up having to like switch our rental order around at the last minute, and we kind of like crammed everybody underneath a porch. It was kind of interesting, but having a better, I was that bride who was like, it's not going to rain on my wedding day. It's not going to rain on my wedding day. It did. So, like positive manifestation vibes can only go so far in certain cases. So having a backup plan is a good idea, but obviously like making sure that it comes in within your budget as well.
Yeah. I didn't even know about wedding insurance. So that's such a great point to bring up.
Yeah. Awesome. It can be a huge saver. Yeah, for sure.
So do you think hiring a wedding planner is necessary? And do you think it could save you money if you do?
I don't think it's necessary, but I think that if you are short on time and you do have, the funds to have somebody assist you with either the planning, or one thing like across the board, I always recommend is at least having a day of coordinator, which is a bit of a misleading term, honestly, because most of the time they kind of manage things the entire month leading up to the day. in terms of organizing like with vendors and deliveries and setup times and creating your timeline and all the logistics that cause an event to run smoothly on the day of, not only helping you kind of like figure out what that looks like, but then also being on site to handle all that stuff so that you as the couple can just relax and enjoy the day, I think is so worth it. So yeah, you can absolutely plan your own wedding. You don't need a wedding planner by any means, but it also really depends on, if you have the funds and if you're short on time and you just want the burden of all of those logistics off of your back. It's a good investment. And there are, perks to working with a professional wedding planner as well. Like, especially if you're working with a more average or higher end budget, they can, work their vendor relationships in your favor in some cases. And they know a lot of resources that you might not otherwise find. And so there's benefits either way, but if you're on a tight budget and you're worried about it, like, don't worry, you can do this on your own.
Yeah, no, I think the day of coordinator is definitely a good idea too. If you're getting married at like a venue, would the venue supply that, or do you have to go out of your way to find one?
So venue coordinators and like a day of coordinator are two kind of different things. Yeah. And ultimately, the venue coordinator is the representative for the venue itself. Whereas if you hire an outside day of coordinator, you're the boss in that case. And you are the one who they want to make the absolute happiest on the day. And so they're going to be liaising with everyone and be the main point of contact. There's just a few differences between the two in the end. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. That's good to know. I wasn't sure. So that's good to know. So what takes up a huge part of a wedding budget that you would least expect?
That you would least expect. I really do think the flowers are something that's shocking to a lot of people. It's just not affordable in a lot of cases. There are options. Obviously, you could DIY, you could arrange them yourself. You could get, silk flowers for part of them. You could do, centerpieces that are not floral at all, maybe just candles or, lanterns or, there's a lot of different things you could do. Also, just greenery is really popular as a look, but also more affordable than just lots and lots of flowers. And, there's also a lot of interesting alternatives now. Like there's a company that does like wooden flowers that look like flowers. There's obviously like silk ones that you can either buy and arrange yourself or get pre-made, or you can even rent silk flower arrangements now. So there's options, but I do think that flowers are the thing that tend to shock people the most.
I would have definitely maybe even said like, what about like hair and makeup? Because I feel like when they hear wedding in front of it, they just jack up the price a lot. Is that true? I feel like people don't necessarily know how much it's going to cost to take up, but it costs a lot.
It does cost a lot. It definitely costs a lot. And it's time and it's artistry and it's product. And, a lot of brides obviously want to do a trial as well before the actual day, which is a good idea, to make sure that you actually like what the artist does for you. So yeah, that's definitely a big one for sure.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely alternatives to flowers and alternatives to even that. If you know of somebody, I would say even work your connections with both of those. You don't know who your friends could know. So definitely ask around.
Yeah. I mean, it takes a village to plan a wedding, especially on a limited budget. And so, yeah, asking your network, your friends, your family, like if they know anybody and, oftentimes like, people might do things for you as a gift.
Yes.
You know, which could be an amazing thing, like whether it's having somebody like bake a cake for you or create, you know, an assortment of desserts for your like dessert table or things like that. Or if you have a friend who does great hair and makeup and maybe isn't a professional, but is just really good at it, like why not utilize the talent in your own group of loved ones?
Yeah. And you just mentioned baking a cake. So you kind of had mentioned this earlier about the cake cutting fee. I wouldn't even have thought of that for a place. That's another kind of big thing in the budget too, right?
Yes, wedding cakes can be very expensive.
Yeah.
Depending on how, you know, ornately decorated they are. There's definitely ways to cut back on that cost as well, whether you have, you know, like a small cake just for cutting and then like serve sheet cake to your guests, which is obviously a much less labor intensive process. The cake cutting fees really tend to come in when you have one of those really ornate, tall tiered cakes, because you have to be very methodical in the way you cut that apart. And it takes time away from, you know, like the caterers to do that. And so oftentimes that's like an added fee in their quote. So something to look out for.
I didn't even think of that. And that's such a good idea to have like a separate sheet cake for everyone else to eat and then having just one for you to cut. That's such that's a good idea.
There's actually places that do like faux cake rentals where they have, you know, dummy cakes basically that are made of styrofoam and covered in fondant, and they look really beautiful and they're great for like a photo. And then they'll have like a little notch in like the bottom tier that does have real cake in it, and they just like make it seamlessly integrate, and then you like pose for your cake cutting photo.
Wow.
But then the actual cake slices are from, you know, a sheet cake in the back.
Wow. I did not know that that's a really great hack. I did not know that. That's crazy.
It's magic. It's
magic. Seriously. Yeah, that's definitely something you want to include in your wedding budget. And it's not uncommon for a bride to say they've gone over their budget. So what from your point of view, what is the best advice you can give someone to stay on their wedding budget?
I think number one, getting clear about what you want to spend, like what you're willing to spend, kind of like your drop dead number. Like, I don't want to spend over X because I have these bigger things that we're planning for down the line. So number one is figuring out exactly how much you want to spend. Number two is keeping track of all of your spending along the way. Like, it's so easy to just be like, oh, I'm going to order this cute white outfit on Amazon, or, oh, I'm going to order these little bridesmaids gifts, or, oh, you know, it's nowadays it is so easy to spend money without even thinking about it, with all of our credit card info saved on our phones, Apple Pay, like, you know, it's easier than ever to, like, they've removed all of the resistance to swiping our credit cards to make purchases. And so really being intentional about tracking every cent that you're spending and making sure to like reallocate if you are going over in one area, I think is super important.
Yeah. And that's the same thing with your regular budget too. Definitely track what you're spending. So
absolutely. And the third thing I would say is just remembering like what are like maybe those bigger goals that you might be taking away from by spending more than you had originally intended on the wedding, and kind of like using that to keep you on track. You know what I mean?
No, definitely. Those are definitely 3 great tips for staying on your wedding budget. So I think that kind of wraps up everything I had to ask about planning your budget wedding. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I mean, we have so many resources at the Budget Savvy Bride. I'd love to invite anybody to come check out our site. We have like free printables, invitations, or something that can be a sticker shock as well. So we have like free templates that you can use with Canva to personalize different paper details of your day. We also have a huge section that we call our wedding deals, where you can actually find discounts. It's like a coupon site for wedding stuff. So you can get discounts on anything from your bridesmaids dresses, suits for the guys, flowers, gifts, beauty stuff. Like there's so much there.
Yeah.
So definitely recommend checking that out as well.
Yeah. And I'll definitely link that in everything in the description of this podcast episode so people can get it right there. It sounds like there's a ton of great resources people can use, especially if they're trying to stay on a good budget. So thank you again for taking time out of the day to talk to me.
Yeah, it was so fun. Thanks for having me.
I can't believe we haven't done a budget wedding planning podcast yet. I learned a ton from today's episode, and I hope all of you did too. When you and your partner are talking about your budget, I think it's a great thing to look at your life beyond your wedding first before you start planning your budget for the big day. After all, you're planning a life together and not just a big day for yourselves. Everyone's wedding budget will look different based on your situation. Your wedding budget should be specific to you and your partner's situation. No matter what the day looks like, the people who really love you will still appreciate it and want to be there to support you both. Start saving for your wedding as soon as possible. You might need to alter your personal budget leading up to your wedding. Jessica's suggestion of a bride hustle was so clever. Take some time before your wedding to make some extra money for the big day. This will help you stress less before and after the day is over. Keep track of all of your spending related to the wedding. It's so easy to spend money and forget about it. You don't want to go over your wedding budget. The only way to assure that you're not going to go over your wedding budget is to keep track of all your spending. I'll link the Budget Savvy Bride in the description of this episode. As Jessica mentioned, they have a ton of helpful and free information on their website to help you get through your big day. And with that being said, that wraps up another episode of Millennial Debt Domination. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you can rate us there, and you can also review us on Apple Podcasts. I'll talk to you next time, Millennials, Gen Zers, and everyone else listening. Bye.